Shadows grew longer against the ground as the sun dipped ever lower beyond the horizon, casting hues of fiery oranges and reds amongst the scattered clouds. On the opposite side of the sky, pinpricks of white light against the silken black backdrop of the night began twinkling into existence. From the farmhouse's top floor at Sweet Apple Acres, Applebloom glanced forlornly out across the farm. She grumbled and flopped back on the bed as a single word pinballed around inside of her head.
Rounded.
Stuck in her bedroom while the whole family was out having a wonderful time with Rarity and her family, Applebloom found herself wishing that Applejack had not taken Winona with her. She sighed regretfully. She had been tasked with cleaning up the barn that day. It had been dark within the structure, and none of the oil lamps were around. Her mind had been preoccupied on her evening with Sweetie, thus she hadn't been thinking too clearly. She tried starting a small fire in the center of the barn with some straw in order to have some light. It would have gotten out of control if Big Mac hadn't been, at that moment, returning some of the lamps. No matter how many times she apologized for the incident, it was all in vain.
What were you thinking? Dry straw light up like a hearth-warming tree. You could have set the whole barn alight. Off to your room, missy, 'cause you're grounded for a week.
Applebloom rolled onto her back and let her tail flop sulkily over the side of the bed. Sighing, she once more looked out the window. The sun was gone now, leaving behind a dying yellow and orange glow in the sky above. The dark blues and purples of the night were slowly inching into place. Off in the distance, lights were winking to life one by one. Applebloom murmured with disappointment. Nothing of interest was visible. She looked towards the horizon. The dusk light was almost gone. The few clouds that remained looked almost pitch black, practically invisible against the darkened sky. Once the sun was gone entirely, anything of interest would be almost impossible to discern. Applebloom frowned, squinting hard against the fading orange backdrop of the horizon. In the distance, a thick bog bank had formed, and it was slowly creeping its way over the farm.
That sprung up rather quickly.
Applebloom thought. In preparation for the oncoming cold, she fished out a scarf from a drawer and wrapped it around her neck. She cast one last look at the fog before shutting and locking the window. She went from room to room, methodically securing all windows before heading downstairs to repeat the same process. The air was decidedly colder when she finished. For good measure, Applebloom decided to throw a couple logs on top of the dying embers of the fire. Feeling a little hungry and maybe hoping a light snack would help warm her up a bit, she headed to the kitchen. In a short while, she had a small plate of sandwiches prepared, which she carried into the living room before she jumped onto the couch and nestled into it. The light from the flickering fire filled the room, casting dancing shadows on the wall behind her as she ate, the crackling of the fire her only companion. Applebloom shivered as she wrapped the scarf tighter around herself. Quickly hopping off the couch to add another log to the fire, she paused when she noticed condensation forming on the windows. She mouthed a silent,
What the?
before trotting over to investigate. Her hoof touched the window and came away wet. Quickly shaking the water off, she wiped a clear view of the outside world across the window and pressed her face up against the glass. The lights from the front porch illuminated the world outside, allowing Applebloom to see the fog that now wafted to the fence that surrounded the house. That indeed had sprung up rather quickly. She hurried back into the kitchen where the family kept the flashlights. Snagging one, she flicked it on and off a few times to see if it was still functional. She'd better check on the animals and make sure they were alright. The air chilled Applebloom to the bone as she stepped outside. The grass was wet and cold as she charged across the farm. Thin tendrils of encroaching fog lazily flowed around her hooves and lapped at her legs. Despite her growing unease, Applebloom reminded herself that the sooner she finished, the sooner she could get back inside. The animals all seemed fine, huddling together inside their various shelters for warmth. Although she could hear nothing but the sounds of her hoof steps, there was this aching feeling that she was being followed, yet upon looking over her shoulder, found nothing. That didn't stop her from sprinting back towards the house once she was finished. Reaching the porch, she wiped her hooves on the welcome mat before turning to gaze out over the farm one last time. Beyond the gate, the fog covered the ground as far as she could see, completely cloaking the edge of the apple orchard within a white veil. Beyond that, the hills were covered with a sheet of white that spilled down the slopes like river rapids in slow motion. She couldn't tell if the fog had reached the town, and considering how freezing it was out here, she wasn't too keen on opening a window to confirm that. It was then she was struck by a thought. What if the town was aware of this fog? Surely the Pegasi would know about it. If that were the case, they would alert Applejack. Her whole family would come right home the instant they heard about this and make sure she was alright. Who knows, maybe Rarity would tag along and bring Sweetie Belle as well. Smiling, she turned about and trotted back inside. She locked the front door and hurried back to the fireplace and her sandwiches, making sure to keep an ear turned towards the front door for when the family returned. She finished off her light snack and turned to look up at the clock on the wall. An incessant pounding on the front door caught her off guard, and she turned towards it with a startle. It briefly paused before starting up again. The family must be back.
I'm coming.
She hollered, jumping down from the couch and trotting towards the front door. She paused halfway. Her family had a key. If they found the front door locked, they'd just unlock it. Why would they be banging at the door? Now alert, she cautiously reached the front door and lifted up the curtain on the window, peering out. Her eyes widened in surprise. A little filly was standing outside just at the bottom of the porch. Her face was obscured by a long red mane, though Applebloom could see she had a pretty-looking pink and white striped dress on. Despite looking relatively harmless, something about the filly sent a slight chill down Applebloom's neck. She had never seen this filly at school before.
Yes?
I'm sorry to bother you. My doll is damaged, and I was wondering if you could lend me a sewing kit to fix it?
Applebloom just stared back. Why was a young filly this far out of town at this hour? She glanced left, then right, unable to see anything else in the fog before turning back to the filly.
What are you doing out here all by yourself?
I was out playing all day, but I lost track of time. By the time I noticed it was getting dark, I was so worried that I ran home as fast as I could, but my doll got caught in a branch and was ripped. My parents would be awfully mad at me if I returned home with my doll ruined, so if I could borrow a sewing kit...
Wouldn't they be madder at you for returning late?
I won't be long. I can even fix my doll right here in the light if you want.
Applebloom's brow furrowed.
Fine.
She fished out Granny Smith's old sewing kit and hurried back to the front door, opened it, and looked out at the filly. She was standing just before the porch, waiting. She hoofed over the basket, and the filly smiled at her.
Thank you.
She said softly, before she started rummaging through the basket. Applebloom watched her from within the doorframe, eyes cementing a stern gaze on her. Suddenly, the filly's head turned.
Sorry to bother you again, but I noticed that you have a large stockpile of straw beside your barn. I don't suppose I could trouble you for just a small amount?
Applebloom eyed her suspiciously. How much was a small amount? Then again, how much could she carry?
So long as it's not too much, you can use some.
Thank you.
She said, and trotted over to the barn. Applebloom watched her, walking to the edge of the porch as the filly moved to the barn, quickly rummaging around through the tarp-covered straw pile sitting in the wagon. Thankfully, she wasn't too difficult to see in the fog, though from what she could see, the filly was pulling out way more than what should have been necessary to fix a doll. Yet she carried it back to her original spot, sat down with her back to the porch, and she started working away.
That's a lot of straw, don't you think?
I have a big doll.
Applebloom narrowed her eyes.
Can I see it?
You can once I'm done. I like you. You're really kind, and you share. I like ponies who share. When I'm finished, would you like to play with me?
Applebloom was starting to feel uneasy.
Shouldn't you, be going home? To your parents?
I already told you, they don't care how long I stay out, just as long as I don't ruin my things. Would you like to play with me?
No. I'm not supposed to have strangers in the house while my family is away.
You're not very nice. I only want to play.
I'm just following the rules. Besides, they'll be back soon. Have you finished yet?
I bet you have lots of toys in your room. Really fun toys too, and games. Lots of really fun games. And pretty dresses, and mane clips, and jewelry.
The filly continued, as if Applebloom hadn't even spoken. Then she stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. No sound passed between them. A trickle of sweat slowly slid down the side of Applebloom's face.
You know what? You can keep the sewing kit. I got dinner in the oven and I can't remember the last time I checked on it. I hope you don't get into too much trouble over your doll. So, bye.
Why won't she play with me?
Apple Bloom paused. The filly was sitting with her back to Apple Bloom, only now her head was looking up, staring off into the distance.
I bet I was right. She has all those things and more. She's just greedy. That's it. Selfish.
Apple Bloom had had enough. She thrust her hoof towards the fence gate.
Okay, I'm gonna need you to get off our land right now.
Excuse me. Could you give me your name then?
My... what?
The filly rose and turned, her face still hidden behind her oversized bangs.
Actually, can I have a hoof? And a limb? No, 2. Could I also trouble you for an ear, please? Your tail looks so pretty. Can I have that too? And your nose? And your fur? It's so beautiful. Can I have a whole coat?
Apple Bloom turned and bolted back inside, slamming the door behind her. She braced herself against it and she attempted to calm her shattered nerves.
Hey, are you listening to me?
Go away, you creep. My family will be home any minute now. I should warn you, my big brother don't exactly take too kindly to trespassers on our land, especially practical jokers.
She screamed, trying to force some bravado into her voice. There was no reply. Cautiously, she lifted up a corner of the curtain. The filly was still sitting where she had been the first time Apple Bloom had seen her. Only this time, she was looking up.
Those curtains in that window are very pretty. I bet that's your room.
She braced herself, and like a cat, she leapt up into the air. Before Apple Bloom could even process what had just transpired, the sound of shattering glass pierced the air.
What the hey?
She hurried over to the kitchen and fished out Granny's large carving knife. Securing it between her teeth, she hurried over to the bottom of the stairs. Looking up to the top, she was relieved to see nothing that shouldn't be there. She bit down harder on the handle, and slowly, she stealthily climbed her way upwards. The lights in her room were still on as she reached the top. Aiming the knife forwards, she slowly edged her head around the corner of the stairs, resting her gaze on the door to her room. The light from her room was the only source of illumination on the top floor. It spilled out into the hallway, lighting up everything around the doorframe. The first thing she saw were a few toys and dresses scattered at the threshold. Then she spied the claw marks, deep gouges that raked the walls, ceiling, and floorboards around the entrance. It all formed a rough trail towards the darkened hallway beyond. Just before the darkness, the filly stood. Apple Bloom couldn't help but clench her teeth harder around the handle, the fur on her brow now matted with sweat.
I was right. You do have such wonderful things. You are a very, very mean girl not to share them with me. I only want to play with you.
The filly stepped forward. Now she was directly on the opposite side of the beam of light coming from her room. Apple Bloom's jaw locked in fright. The filly's dress was tattered and torn, its front caked in what were suspicious dark brown splotches, but it was her face that drew her focus. It was withered and wrinkled like a burlap sack. Her mane had been pulled back to revel button eyes and a mouth crisscrossed with numerous stitch marks. The mouth opened, straining against the stitch marks like a cage. It held no teeth but was instead just jagged lines that stretched around the muzzle from ear to ear. The mane itself was interwoven with long strands of dried grass and straw, along with gnarled vines falling in tangles all around its head, as well as protruding from various seams in her dress. Then she saw what was behind the filly. In the darkness beyond, hovering above her were a set of glowing red eyes. She couldn't see anything else, just those eyes. The clattering of the knife escaped her ears.
As you can see, my doll is damaged very badly. I told you I'd let you see it when I was done. Unlike you, I'm nice.
The voice, hollow and deep, came from the eyes. Applebloom's mouth hung open in abject disbelief.
I don't have very many nice things. You have lots of nice things. Things you won't share. My doll is the only nice thing I have. Now look at it. It's ruined.
The filly took another step forwards. It now stood in the light, and Applebloom could see the stitch marks made from the string of Granny's sewing kit, from the jaw to the neck and down the chest that vanished into the dress. From between the stitch marks, she could see the borrowed straw poking out.
My parents always told me not to play too rough with my toys. I tried to fix it, but it only made things worse. My parents do hate it when I ruin my things.
Applebloom was frozen with fear. Her breath was lodged in her throat, her limbs locked, her eyes glued to the whore before her.
I just wanted a few things to replace the damaged parts. Just a few? Why did you have to be so selfish?
The voice was getting angrier now. Before Applebloom could even respond, the glowing eyes appeared to dim.
You have lots of nice things. So many. Why wouldn't you just give me a few? So, I decided not to borrow a few things. I'll just take all of you.
A loud, high-pitched scream filled the air, and Applebloom recognized it as her own. She couldn't will herself to move. The filly creature began to move forwards. As it did so, something started to push from behind its face, pushing out at the muzzle, stretching against the wrinkled skin until with a sickening terror, it peeled away. The face was now a bone-white cone, tapering with a blood-red tentacle. The front hooves bulged and exploded to reveal a skeletal like two-toed claws. Finally, the midsection strained and tore. Vines, leaves, sticks, and straw all cascaded forward, interlacing together to form an interwoven mess of nightmarish foliage. It continued its advance, emulating that of an octopus as it undulated towards her. The sight gave Applebloom the shove needed to force her limbs to move, but she was still frozen with fear, so that only made her back legs give way. She had been at the top of the stairs, so her retreat morphed into a tumble as she fell and landed upside down at the bottom. At the top, the monster hadn't ceased its chase. It moved down the stairs, climbing to the railings and clinging to the ceiling. Its bony claws reached for her. She didn't scream, but she rolled backwards onto her front hooves, before propelling herself up and over to land on all fours. The claws slashed the floor where she had been just mere moments ago.
I want it. All of it. Stop being such a selfish pig and give it to me.
The voice shouted from somewhere at the top of the stairs. Applebloom backpedaled until she hit the sofa. The creature slashed at her, and she leaped. This time she wasn't fast enough, and a claw nicked her hind leg, drawing an inch-long gash across the exposed limb. She cried out more in shock than pain, as she tumbled over the sofa, bounced off it, and landed on the ground. The couch lifted off the ground before being torn in half. Both halves were sent flying as the creature surged forwards.
Now, look at what you've done. You've ruined everything.
The disjointed, unholy voice raged. Applebloom gave the creature a quizzical look before glancing down at her bleeding leg.
This never would have happened if you had been a nice girl and shared.
It began slugging towards her, and Applebloom backed away when it stopped suddenly. Applebloom paused. The creature appeared to be straining, but something was holding it back. No, keeping it at bay. Turning, Applebloom saw the fireplace with the fire still crackling away. She turned back to the creature, its body heaving. Beyond, she could make out the frustrated growls of the voice. Then her gaze zeroed in on the dry foliage that stuffed its body. Slowly, the warnings Applejack had given her about the dangers of dry straw returned. One corner of Applebloom's mouth turned up.
You don't like fire, do you?
The voice didn't respond.
No. Your little doll thing doesn't like the fire. All those dry sticks and leaves, and especially that straw. One little spark, and whoosh.
Applebloom pointed at its body. Looking up at the creature, she became confident in knowing what she had to do. The creature backed away, whilst the voice kept silent. Keeping her eye on the thing, she reached over to the wood pile and selected a thin log. Then lifting it up, she stood on her hind legs, keeping the bulk of weight off of her damaged leg, as she unwrapped her scarf and wrapped it around the end. Then she stuck it into the fireplace. The scarf caught instantly, and she lifted on the log, holding it up like a torch.
Now, here's what we're gonna do. I'm not gonna set fire to your doll, and you leave nice and quiet like.
To her surprise, crying filled the air.
I just wanted to fix my doll! Why did you have to be so mean?
Applebloom hesitated for only a second before she moved the burning torch closer.
I mean it. You have until the count of 10 before I start a bonfire, right here, using you as the kindling.
I hate you! I hate you, I hate you, I hate you!
The voice screamed at her. Then, as if yanked by a fishing line, the creature abruptly flew backward and up the stairs out of view. Applebloom's head arched up towards the ceiling as she listened to the pandemonium raging upstairs as furniture and walls were destroyed. The voice screamed over and over before the cacophony abruptly ended with an explosion of splintering wood. There was a muffled thud from outside and hobbling over the front door. Applebloom threw aside the curtain to watch a fuzzy blur disappearing into the fog. She opened the door and waited until it was gone. Suddenly, for reasons she couldn't quite explain, she felt a pang of sympathy for it, though she didn't know why.
I'm sorry.
You ruined my doll! You're not sorry! You're not sorry at all! But you will be!
Silence reigned once more. For a moment, Applebloom just stood there. All around her, the fog was retreating. The glow from the town was visible from the tops of the trees once again, while in the sky above, the moon now illuminated the night with its pale, white glow. She watched as the filly finally vanished from view before heading back outside. Retrieving her makeshift torch, she carefully roamed the house, once again punctuously checking the locks on all the doors and windows. She paused at her now ruined bedroom. Everything had been destroyed. The bed, the wardrobe, her toys. One corner of her mouth rose around the torch it held, exposing her teeth as a muffled snarl escaped. Her eyes roamed over the shredded remains of her best dresses. That monster deserved no sympathy from her. All her pretty dresses, all her favorite toys, gone. The sound of her front hooves slamming the door echoed throughout the night. How dare it accuse her of being selfish? Truly, it was the selfish one. Applebloom surreptitiously scratched at the gash on her leg. Trotting inside, she stopped at the massive hole that had once been a wall and gazed out towards the town of Ponyville. How long did her family plan to be staying at Sweetie Belle's house? Didn't they realize she had almost been killed? How selfish of them. She paused and thought. Sweetie Belle. She had staggering amounts of pretty dresses, and her toys. Sweet Celestia, did she have lots of wonderful toys. She smiled. They were best of friends after all. Applebloom was confident that Sweetie would share some, if not all of her toys with her best friend in the whole world. Sweetie Belle wasn't selfish, and with all of her own toys and dresses destroyed, she'd understand.